This is the Value Investor Podcast with Tracy Reinick. All things value, all the time.
Welcome to this week's Value Investor Podcast. Now, you might have noticed that the music is a little different on week 2 versus week 1 if you listen to our first episode. And that's because my colleague here at Zacks, Dave Bartosiak, listened to the first episode and was basically yelling in his cubicle that the music was awful. So I decided to mix it up because I do trust his opinion on things like this. And so we're going with a little bit different kind of jazzy tunes. So hopefully people enjoy that a little bit more. I'm waiting to see what Dave will say this week. So who knows? You'll have to tune in on week 3 to find out if we kept the same music. But turning to our value stocks, this week, it's going to be an interesting topic, I think, because I'm getting a lot of questions from people on StockTwits about really cheap stocks. So is it really a cheap stock or is it a value trap? That's what I want to cover, because value traps still exist out there. Everyone throws that term around a lot, but the value trap thing is real. And what I would consider the definition of a value trap is that it's a stock that appears to be cheap because it has low valuations. So in this case, I was looking up stocks that had low valuations in the PE, so low PEs. But something else is really going on that doesn't make it appear as cheap as it seems to appear, like when you first glance at the numbers. So, it could be anything that makes it appear cheap, but it's really not. But the thing I like to look at to see if it's a value trap or a cheap stock is whether or not the earnings are trending higher or trending lower. And a lot of value trap stocks, the earnings are actually declining. So that is a good way to determine if you have a value trap stock or if it's just cheap. So I'm going to go over a couple examples of stocks that may be value traps or maybe cheap stocks and tell you why I think they're one or the other, to give you some ideas of how you too can determine whether or not you should be in one of these. And also at the end of the podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about whether or not you should actually be buying the value traps, because they're not always bad. They could be traps, but it depends on your length of time and how long you want to hold these kinds of stocks. So let's jump right in to some of the examples. And I want to start off with an area that to me is clearly a value trap area. And these are the rail car makers. Everyone who's followed me for a while on StockTwits knows that I've invested in this area over the last couple of years, and they were booming. And this is a cyclical stock. So when the economy is doing really well, the big railroads will go out and buy the rail cars. Those are the ones you see on the end, on all the railroads going across the country carrying goods. And they wear out. You got to get new ones. We just recently had some regulation changes that also makes some have to get new rail cars as well. So there was a huge orders for rail cars over the last couple of years, certainly since the Great Recession. But that is kind of come to an end now and is slowing. So suddenly the earnings are actually declining for a lot of these rail cars. So let's look at an example. Greenbrier, their ticker is GBX. They have a forward PE of only 5.4. So you look at that and you're thinking, wow, that's really, really cheap. But earnings are expected to decline this fiscal year by 4.7%. And then next year, you really see the hit of no one actually ordering these rail cars and their backlog declining. And it's supposed to decline another 35%. So in 2015, when things were still going good, they made $6.09. This fiscal year, they're supposed to make $5.80. So that's not so bad. But then if it really falls off a cliff next year, they're supposed to make $3.75. So when I look at this, I think it's cheap, but their earnings are really, that's not a good scene. Now, because it's a cyclical, this is historically what's happened with the rail cars. They have a couple years of pullback where the earnings will decline, and then the cycle starts all over again, because then companies decide, oh, I need some more rail cars now again, or they're old or whatever, and then the earnings will slowly turn and start to trickle up. So, but we're not there yet. Got a couple years, it looks like, until you start to see the earnings reverse there. Another area that I consider to be pretty cyclical here is the fertilizers. These have been in a world of pain, and I looked specifically at CF Industries. Their ticker is CF. They're not as cheap as Greenbrier, but they are cheap compared to the overall market. Their PE, forward PE, is 14, but they too have a similar earnings decline and problem. They made 388 in 2015. They're only supposed to make 184 in 2016. That's a decline of 52%. And then 2017, you see a little bit of a comeback at 209. So that remains to be seen whether or not we'll see a turn in the fertilizer market. A lot of that is because the fertilizer prices have actually plunged, similar to what we've seen with oil. Similar has happened to fertilizers. So they, have really taken a hit there. So those two companies, I believe, are value traps. That means they look cheap, but the earnings are really in decline. Now, I also looked at some that weren't so cyclical. So General Motors is really cheap right now. They have a forward PE of 5.6. And people who are in my value investor portfolio know that we own General Motors for several years. And then we just recently sold it because of the earnings picture, which I'm going to go into right now. So 2016, earnings look pretty good. They're supposed to rise about 15%, but everybody's worried about peak auto. The auto sales are at record highs in the North America. How much higher can they go? Is the consumer, tapped out? Did they buy all the cars they're going to buy? Maybe, because in 2017, earnings are supposed to decline about 1%. That's not as bad as what we've seen with some of these other companies I just discussed, but that's, it's not going in the right direction either. So they made 502 in 2015. They're supposed to make 577 this year. So that story is still good. But 2017, basically it's flat to down slightly at 574. So basically flat. I wouldn't necessarily say that this was a value trap, but, it's dirt cheap. You're going to maybe have to have patience with this one and really watch those earnings estimates and see what's going on with those. One other stock I feel like I really should address because it's been cheap for a long time is Apple. They have a forward PE of only 11.7, so that's, definitely cheap compared to other tech companies and what the overall market is doing. But they too actually are having a decline in earnings. So I took a look at that. 2015, they made 922. This year, 2016, they're expected to make only 821. And then they get a little bit of a rebound in 2017, they're supposed to make 886. So earnings decline of about 10% this year, and then fiscal 2017 up about 8%. So Apple, though, is not really cyclical. They don't have like some kind of plan where, their product sells for a little while and then doesn't sell, like a Greenbrier where everybody buys what it is they're selling and then doesn't need to buy it for several years. Although some people could argue that is kind of the case with their phones and some of their other items. But, that one I feel is not completely the same situation as Greenbrier or CF Industries. And you might be getting it pretty cheap here. Not so much of a value trap, but again, I would be watching those estimates for earnings, and you can also look at sales estimates too to see what those are doing because those have been in decline for Apple as well. So another question is, should you buy any of these? Like should you buy the value trap like Greenbrier or CF Industries? What if you have a couple years? You could hold on to these stocks for a couple years. One of the things that companies like this tend to do is pay a dividend to kind of reward you for hanging out in their stock for a while. And you definitely see that with CF Industries. Their dividend is yielding 4.7%. Of course, it's never guaranteed because, if worse things happen in the fertilizer industry, a lot of the fertilizers have been cutting their dividends. But for right now, you're getting a 4.7% yield to be patient in there. Greenbrier pays 2.7%. General Motors is pretty juicy too. They're paying 4.7. So I did feel like that was something to be patient in the General Motors shares when I owned it in the value investor. And then Apple also pays a dividend. It's actually the lowest of all these four at 2.3%, but they're also paying you to be, patient with what their story is. So does the dividend give you a little bit more confidence or allow you to sit in there? It depends on what your views on investing are, because, I feel like you shouldn't be sitting in a dead stock for years, even if you are getting a dividend, just waiting for the turnaround. So some of these that are considered to be value traps, I feel are a little more, dead stock territory, because we know the earnings are in decline and that it's not going to rebound for a year or two. So with the rail cars, we know that we're not going to see the rebound for a while. It's not so clear with General Motors what's going to happen with those earnings, because, while everybody says it's peak auto, that's not set in stone. Nobody knows for sure. And Apple, nobody knows what kind of new products or new things that they might come out with. So as far as being cheap stocks, I would put General Motors and Apple in the cheap stock category, and I would still keep CF Industries and Greenbrier in those value traps. So it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to hang out in them. Like I said, I'm not a big proponent of hanging out, but if you've got, multi-year strategies and you are getting a dividend, or maybe you're dollar cost averaging into these, monthly or quarterly, that kind of thing, then, the value traps are one to keep an eye on. Some of these have bad Zacks ranks because of the decline in the earnings estimates, like CF Industries. A lot of the fertilizers have been number 4s, which is a sell, and a number 5s, the strong sells. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But definitely look at the earnings estimates, because I think that's an area that you can really determine whether or not it's a cheap stock or the value trap. So this is wrapping up this week's podcast. So I hope, it answers some of the questions about this topic, because I know it's a big deal right now. And I probably will be covering a lot more on what actually is a cheap stock, because I know that people think that there aren't any. And I covered that a little bit last week. But going forward, we're going to be talking a little bit more about how to find some more of these cheap stocks than just these 4 that I gave you here. So we talked about Greenbrier, which is GBX, General Motors, GM, CF Industries, CF, and Apple APPL. So until next week, I'll see you then.